Cardinal Godfrey Danneels passed on from this mortal coil on March 14th, 2019. Yesterday, to be precise. I had planned on featuring the Cardinal in an episode of Profiles of the Lavender Mafia next week, but his passing required some restraint. Instead, I'll fill you in on what contributions he made to the Church, if you can call them that. Danneels was an important figure in the Catholic Church, to be sure, as he was featured prominently standing on the loggia behind Pope Francis in 2013, when the pontiff was newly elected and first introduced to the world. For a lot of Catholics, his mere presence on the loggia that day signaled clearly what kind of pontificate we were all in for. They turned out to be right, and you'll see why shortly. Like Ted McCarrick, Cardinal Danneels had a meteoric rise in the Church, becoming an archbishop at the age of 44 and being elevated to the office of cardinal just 6 years later. He has been a cardinal of the Church for 35 years, making him influential in the selection process of 2 popes, even if he wasn't always on the winning side, as we shall see. A rather measured Catholic Herald article described Danneels in the following way. He was a champion of liberal Catholicism, who was a prominent member of the St. Gallen group of churchmen, who reportedly campaigned for Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio to be Pope at the 2005 conclave. After Pope Francis's election in 2013, he called his election of Francis a personal resurrection experience. Francis invited Danneels to participate in the 2014-2015 synods on the undermining of the family, which famously produced the documents that would become Amoris Laetitia. The closeness to Pope Francis may have been due to Danneels' self-admitted membership in the St. Gallen group, which Danneels himself once called a mafia. That St. Gallen mafia's aim was to counter the growing influence of Cardinal Ratzinger under the pontificate of John Paul II, serving as a sort of outlet where these hand-picked cardinals and bishops could express their impatience at the supposedly traditional mindset of John Paul II and his closest counselor. The official biography of Cardinal Danneels goes so far as to admit that they had been promoting the man who would become Pope Francis since the early 2000s as an alternative to Cardinal Ratzinger. They initially disbanded the Mafia when Ratzinger was elected Pope in 2005, only to bring the group back together hastily when he resigned in 2013. One of Danneels' biographers said in an interview in 2015 that the election of Bergoglio was prepared in St. Gallen, without a doubt, and the main lines of the program the Pope is carrying out are those that Danneels and company were starting to discuss more than 10 years ago. This is why it is absolutely fair to call Cardinal Danneels a liberal, if not an outright modernist. The St. Gallen Mafia had been agitating for a so-called reformer in the See of Peter, one who would bring the Church into the modern world. The hope was for a supreme pontiff who would finish the work of the Second Vatican Council, work that the revolutionary voices in the Church felt was left unfinished because John Paul II and Benedict XVI were too attached to tradition, according to them. Of course, from the perspective of many of you, those 2 popes merely instituted the supposed reforms of the Council more slowly than Danneels would have liked. Either way, the pace of revolution was going too slowly. Danneels and his co-conspirators sought a more rapid transformation of the Church, along the lines we see today, since the early 2000s at least, though some reports hint that they had a candidate in mind since the 1990s, though Jorge Bergoglio probably wouldn't have been seen as papabile until he was elevated by John Paul II to the office of cardinal in the early 2000s. Quoting another of Danneels' biographers on this, quote, "They wanted church reform. They wanted to bring the Church closer to the hearts of people. They moved forward by stages. At the beginning of the year 2000, when John Paul II's end was becoming more foreseeable, they thought more strategically about what was going to happen to the Church after John Paul II. When Cardinal Silvestrini joined the group, it took on a more tactical and strategic character." End quote. All of that should raise red flags for people. After all, campaigning at the conclave for the election of a pontiff is prohibited by canon law. However, there has always been some level of campaigning and scheming in the 85 papal conclaves we've had to date, and I'm not sure what the line is for campaigning at a conclave, and when a cardinal or other figure has crossed that line. Perhaps a canon lawyer who might be watching can let us know in the comments. Either way, the St. Gallen Mafia was brazen about its desire to elevate a so-called reformer to the papacy. What reforms were they wanting to institute? Certainly not ones that defended the vulnerable from the predations of clergymen who are members of the Rainbow Coalition. Cardinal Danneels had been directly implicated in the cover-up of sexual abuse. He was caught on tape in 2010 discouraging a sex abuse victim from reporting that he had been abused for 13 years by Bishop Roger Van Gwilly. The victim was that bishop's nephew. Danneels actually encouraged the victim to remain silent on the issue, and instead encouraged him to acknowledge your own guilt, quote-unquote. Upon the release of the tape, during which Danneels also told the victim to ask for forgiveness, Van Gwilly admitted the abuse and resigned. If that sounds familiar at all, recall that Mr. McCarrick engaged in similar kinds of behavior, tied directly to his own predatory activity. I'm not saying that Danneels preyed upon anyone himself, though, to be crystal clear. It's just that the behavior is very similar. In addition to all of that, and rather predictably, Danneels was a champion of secular leftist causes, including the spread of same-sex unions, with the caveat that they not be called marriage legally, which is a distinction without merit, among other liberal reforms. Let's have a look at an older article on this so you can see what I mean, because he advocated some seriously twisted legal issues. Cardinal Danneels tried to convince Belgian king to sign bill legalizing abortion, according to a former prime minister. This was reported in April of 2015. Two Belgian politicians have openly stated that Cardinal Godfried Danneels, former Archbishop of Mechelen, Brussels, in Belgium, and a personal pick of Pope Francis to take part in the Synod on the Family, tried to convince King Baudouin that he should sign the Belgian abortion bill into law in 1990. The king was deeply reluctant to go against his personal respect for innocent human life, and a major political crisis was looming over his refusal to cooperate. Philippe Moreau, a member of the Belgian Socialist Party and vice prime minister at the time, and Mark Eyskens, member of the Christian Democrat CVP party and former prime minister, have confirmed that several members of the Belgian government called on the cardinal to exert pressure on the king. As an interjection, let's repeat that. A member of the Belgian Socialist Party called on Cardinal Danneels to exert pressure on the king to legalize abortion. Let's continue. King Baudouin remained firm in his determination not to participate in any way in the legalization of abortion. He finally accepted formally to ask the government to find a solution that would guarantee respect for parliamentary democracy. This resulted in his fictitious stepping down as King of the Belgians for 36 hours, while the law, which had been approved by the legislature 5 days previously, was signed by the 14 members of the government in the night from April 3rd to the 4th of 1990. The Belgian parliament voted the king back into office on April 5th. The Belgians were only to be informed of the dramatic events later that day. Wow, that sounds shady. Cardinal Danneels has refused to comment on Moreau and Eyskens' statements. I'll bet he did. Cardinal Danneels' alleged role in the affair was mentioned in 2001 by his biographer Peter Jan Bogaert, although he did not say whether the cardinal had indeed spoken directly with the king about the matter. While it is certain that the cardinal was personally opposed to the legalization of abortion, he is also known to have said that he totally approved the separation between church and state, considering the church as having no political power whatever. Bogaert specified, the cardinal acknowledges that we live in a pluricultural society and that its standards increasingly clash with the church's teachings. At the time, the cardinal did not comment on what amounts to an accusation, at least in the eyes of conservative Catholics. 14 years later, it appears that not only did Cardinal Danneels exert pressure on the king, but that he was used by the coalition government of the Christian Democrat Wilfried Martens, the prime minister who signed the abortion bill even though he refused to vote for it, in order to move out of the constitutional deadlock created by the king's conscientious objection. During the days that preceded the king's incapacitation, Martens and other ministers went to see him and argued for hours against his refusal to sign the bill into law. Baudouin told them his stance was not a religious one. If you, Claes, he said to one of them, were to come here with the Pope from Rome, I would still say no. Don't look for a link with religion. You know that I am a profound believer, but for me it is a question of the respect that I have for human life, he stressed. If you want to read the rest of that for yourself, you can. There's a link on the Sources blog. So we have a Cardinal Archbishop of the Catholic Church being enlisted by socialist politicians to aid in the legalization of abortion, going so far as to help unseat a king temporarily to legalize the killing of children. That's a wretched legacy to leave behind by itself. But notice in that article that Cardinal Danneels was personally opposed to abortion. That's a familiar refrain for Catholics in the United States, Australia, and Canada. Americans are frequently treated to the sight of the likes of Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, and others going through the motions of displaying their Catholic faith in public while then working to further the legal slaughter of children in the name of personal liberty. To have politically powerful Catholics do this is bad enough, but to have a cardinal of the Catholic Church who is close enough to the papacy that he could play the role of pope maker at a conclave is beyond reprehensible. Yet that's what Daniels was. And this isn't even a complete list of his questionable and reprehensible activities either. But what we've seen here gives us an idea of what the St. Gallen Mafia is and was. The members of that group are all older and, like Daniels, some are deceased. But they have a legacy. Remember, Ted McCarrick was the link between the St. Gallen Mafia and the Rainbow Coalition's activities in the church itself. McCarrick was both St. Gallen and Lavender Mafia. That should give us all pause, because McCarrick's career was similar to Daniels's, including his rubbing shoulders with questionable politicians and political causes. That's been the common thread with the Lavender Mafia, to be sure. If you saw my video on Cardinal Bernardin, then you'll know what I'm talking about. In closing, our Lord commanded us to pray for our enemies. While I hesitate to call Cardinal Daniels an enemy, mostly because I don't know what the state of his soul was at his death, he probably needs your prayers. Pray that he made a good confession before his death and that he repented. He needs it, as do most of us, quite frankly. Thank you for listening and for your support. And if you want to support my work, there are options in the description of this video. I ask that people continue to pray and do acts of penance for the liberation and exaltation of the Church. I am Anthony Stein. Viva Cristo Rey.